So I am so excited for this cancer conversation because I have as my guest Mark Lintern, who wrote the book Cancer Resolution. Think about that for a minute. And then we have Robin Daly, who runs the charity Yes to Life. And these gentlemen are going to help transform the future of health and humanity. So let's dive in right into their story. So Mark, why don't you tell us how this book came about?
Hey, thank you for having me on. It's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. Um, yeah, how did I get into this field? Well, after my own cancer diagnosis, my initial intention was to just learn a little bit more about the disease to prevent it, essentially. Then a number of years later, I delved deeper into the research in order to support a friend who'd been diagnosed with cervical cancer. And of course, this threw up quite a new understanding of the disease, really. My investigations quickly kind of led me to realize that cancer patients aren't necessarily being fully informed, and oncologists were potentially targeting the wrong feature of cancer. This is quite deep into my research. So, for instance, I was shocked to learn that there are at least 7 different theories of cancer, at least.
Right.
And that the root cause of cancer remains unknown, because we're often presented with the notion that cancer is a genetic disease. And that was my initial understanding until I delved into the research. So this understanding of these other theories contradicted and challenged the established narrative, which is obviously presenting the disease of cancer as a genetic disease. Now, all this talk of cancer theory, as I'm discussing at the moment, matters because cancer treatments are developed from cancer theory.
Correct.
And each theory offers a different therapeutic approach. So when I came to understand this, this kind of angered me in terms of when I was trying to help my friend, because it meant that she wasn't aware of the other treatment options that are associated with these other theories. Now, this is important for cancer patients to understand, because there's always the question of, when you're a cancer patient, what can I do to possibly support standard of care treatment? So it's an open question. And you have so much information online. It can be, if you're not careful, you can get lost in that information. Whereas if you look at the theories of cancer and you realize that they have treatments associated with them, they have the evidence and science to support those theories. So it's not woohoo, it's not anecdotal evidence,
Right.
you're relying on. So it's really important scientific basis behind the therapies that are associated with these theories. So it's a good way for cancer patients to start understanding how cancer potentially operates, and the other additional therapeutics that can be available to them. So that's super important. Now, I was really angry at this because my friend unfortunately passed away after a year.
Mm.
Her passing then motivated me to continue my research. And from this, again, the realization that the somatic mutation theory, the dominant theory that most oncologists subscribe to, is the least, or appears to be the least accurate of the 7 theories I've just alluded to. Not only does the accuracy of a theory determine the effectiveness of the treatment, but some of these other theories appear to be more accurate than the established genetic theory. So this suggests that if Sam had adopted some of these other treatments, as well as standard of care, then that might have improved his survival outcome. So this loss of my friend, as well as understanding a certain level of the different theories of cancer, and that cancer, because of this, the underlying mechanism behind cancer is unknown, this loss of Sam drove me, and added this desire to inform family and friends so that I didn't experience the same thing with them. And over the course of 8 years research, I didn't set out to do this, but I stumbled across a significant finding that led me to ultimately write a new theory. And with that theory, the cell suppression theory, I was able to explain all 10 hallmarks of cancer, which are the metric by which cancer theories, the accuracy of cancer theories are measured.
Correct.
So, and I use those in order to validate essentially or give credibility to my theory. This indicated that I'd identified, being the fact that I could explain all 10, my theory is the first to actually explain all 10. This indicated that I'd uncovered a key feature of the cancer puzzle. I also suggested that the treatments or the therapeutic approach that becomes evident from my theory could possibly improve the survival outcomes of all cancer patients. Now, because I'm a graphic designer by trade, and I'm self-taught in this field, so I'm classed as a citizen scientist, I needed to try and disseminate this theory out into the wider world, but I needed to gain credibility for that. So upon doing my research, I found that it was a good opportunity for me to contact Robin Daly from the cancer charity Yes to Life, and I pitched my theory to him over about 4 hours, I think it was, to see if he found any validity in the theory and to see if there was a way that we could move forward to disseminate the theory to the wider public. And I'll introduce Robin now just to go through that process and explain what we did after that in order to validate the theory.
Okay, great. I love it.
Okay, yeah, I'll pick up the story there. Yeah, great to be on, by the way. Thank you very much. And Mark sent me a letter and he said, yeah, I've got this new theory of cancer. And I was like, so we set up a Zoom call. And as Mark said, it did, I think it went over the 4-hour mark. And he was just giving me a potted version of his book. And I'm a non-scientist, okay? I'm not a medic of any kind. I'm not a scientist, nothing, all right? But I know a lot of what's going on because I've been doing this job of being chairman of the charity for 20 years. So, I keep an eye on things at a certain level. So, this was a bit of a deep dive for me, but Mark was very patient and he went through it all in detail with me. And, I was certainly interested by the end of it. And so we set out from there to say, well, okay, we got a new idea here. It needs to be put out there so we can at least find out whether there are holes in it, whether it is of value to people. So we thought, well, how on earth are we going to do this? And we had a few ideas, but in the end, we settled on having a professional event. And we had an online event. And in that, we had 10 expert panelists. And we had a group of expert citizen scientists, a bit like Mark. We had a group of clinicians, and we had a group of cancer scientists. Some of these people were quite distinguished names, and these people, they were presented to by Mark over the course of a day, his entire theory, step by step. The audience was all made up of cancer professionals as well, about 200 of them. Now, the panelists and the audience all got the opportunity to vote on every step of Mark's theory, every logical steps as he took everybody through it. And we milled all this data like mad and got lots out from it. But the overall result was that he got about 7.5 out of 10 from everybody for the whole thing, which was, for a brand new idea about cancer, it was stunningly good, I thought, because some people didn't think anything of it at all, of course. But some people some very distinguished people were giving 10s, so very interesting how it went down. And so overall, it was very well received. So we did that event, and that was kind of the prelude then to Mark publishing his book. We finished the book off and got it out there. Mark self-published a few months afterwards, and he's taken it on from there. And it's beginning to get a little bit of traction here and there. He's getting quite well known. He has a following on Facebook of people who are interested, and as well on LinkedIn, who are all discussing it like mad. And I think it's true to say at this point that nobody has blasted a massive hole through Mark's theory and said, look, it can't possibly be true because. So it's very interesting. I think it's very exciting that somebody's come completely from left field like this And, having gone through literally blow by blow, I've been through his book, full stop by full stop with him, and understanding everything that he did to get to the conclusion he got to, I can well see how somebody who had a scientific or medical background wouldn't have been able to come to the conclusions he did. Literally, his bonus here was his complete open-mindedness and lack of training, funnily enough. Gave him no preconceptions, and he just wanted to find some answers. So, exciting journey, and I think he's not the only one who's making this kind of journey now. There's a few citizen scientists out there and making some massive steps forward for people with cancer, and I think it's fantastic because we need it. Let's face it.
That's correct. You're absolutely right. We need it, and the good thing is Mark had no filters,
Exactly.
and he was open to the universe, and so that's how you come to your information being so. Nothing is impossible. It's all possible. Right. So Mark, you want to, really tell the audience, probably talk about the hallmarks of cancer and then how your theory kind of fit into, the fungal theory.
Yeah. Well, I've got a series of slides if you'd like me to.
Yes, that would be awesome.
Them. Yeah, I'll just share my screen first. Okay, let me know if you can see that.
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, so I'm just going to prelude this with going through a number of the theories, because I think, again, it's important to touch on the theories before, just providing some context, really.
Yes.
So as we see, this is a healthy cell, and I'm really simplifying things here just so that we can focus on the things that really matter, that seem to matter with the theories that I've been looking at. And obviously we've got a DNA within the nucleus, and mitochondria, and essentially the energy system of the cell. So mitochondria being the primary energy system of most cells. It varies between cells, but also glycolysis, I would suggest for ease of purposes, is that it's the backup energy system. They both work in conjunction with each other. So let me make sure.
And I think most people know the mitochondria are the powerhouse engines of the cell that are responsible for the currency of life, which is ATP.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And mitochondria are much more than that. They deal with cell death mechanisms. They sense a lot of what's going on in the cell. They bidirectionally converse with the DNA. There's so much more. They're actually defensive mechanism for the cell as well. So, but here, just very quickly, just going to describe, this is the energy process, the primary energy system using oxygen and glucose through the process of OXPHOS, generates 36 ATP units of energy per glucose molecule. And then we have glycolysis, which is a fermentation process where oxygen isn't used, and basically results in 2 ATP units of energy. So here we see that this is a less efficient use of glucose, because in order to acquire the same amount of energy that mitochondria do, you've got to increase the amount of glucose. So we're looking at least around about 18, and by all means, correct me if I'm wrong here, 18 times the amount of glucose in order to reach the same amount of energy. So glycolysis is essentially a glucose-heavy energy system, and that really matters when it comes to discussing the theories. So move over to a cancer cell. What we see straight away is there are DNA mutations, there are issues with the DNA, and then there are also major issues with the metabolism of the cell, the energy system of the cell. So what we see is mitochondria appear to be dysfunctional. They're no longer producing energy in the same way they were previously using oxygen. However, they are still absorbing oxygen, and they're producing reactive oxygen species. But the cancer cell primarily relies upon glycolysis. This is known as the Warburg effect. Otto Warburg in the 1920s discovered this process where oxygen, even in the presence of oxygen, glycolysis is occurring, which is unfavorable and odd, which gave the impression that mitochondria are faulty. Now, the beauty of this is that this abnormal metabolism occurs in all solid cancers, to varying degrees. Prostate cancer is slightly different. This this operates later on, comes to pass later on in the process. But this highlights there's a consistency to cancer, which is something that the metabolic theory has done really well in highlighting. So if I just quickly go through to highlight the many theories that exist, you have the somatic mutation theory, which is the established theory. DNA mutations cause the disease. There's this understanding that certain pathogens cause around 20% of the disease, including bacteria, but I've just named viruses here in the viral theory. These are oncogenic viruses that damage DNA. So in effect, it's not actually really the virus that mediates the process. The virus kind of influences DNA, possibly damaging it, causing mutations, which then lead to the development of cancer. So it's almost like the viral theory is an offshoot of the somatic mutation theory. Then we have the metabolic theory, which obviously deals with the abnormal metabolism of the cell. And we have the atavistic theory, which is kind of a combination between the two, mainly favoring the metabolic side of the metabolic theory, but trying to explain theory in a manner of looking at which DNA genes are upregulated and downregulated. So the atavistic theory tries to explain the disease from the perspective really of the metabolic theory, but in the sense that it's utilizing an ancient pathway from evolution, in the sense that the cell is choosing to revert back to almost a single-celled organism and using that ancient pathway within it to survive. The next theory of note would be the tissue organization field theory. So what we're looking at here is the cellular terrain. This theory suggests that actually cancer is influenced greatly by the signals within the terrain. When you damage this terrain and cause excessive inflammation, the growth suppression signals from these cells is disrupted, and then that leads to the overgrowth of cells ending up or resulting in a tumor. So the idea with this is to protect the terrain of the cell, the terrain of the body. So you're looking at detoxifying and reducing that inflammation. That's super important. Then you've also got the cancer stem cell theory, and that essentially deals with a superior type of cell. These stem cells essentially regenerate most of our tissue, and they've been found to be present around 2% of the tumor mass. And these can be related to chemotherapy resistance, unlimited growth, and metastasis of the cancer itself. So these are super important to address.
Correct.
Now, why does this all matter? And I've mentioned it before. All these different theories have different treatments associated with them. So as I've just already touched on, the cancer stem cell theory will be trying to target cancer stem cells. The tissue organization field theory, looking at inflammation, reducing or trying to bring back the terrain to normal health. The metabolic theory is looking at metabolic treatments, and the viral theory is looking at targeting viruses, and somatic mutation theory, the genetic aspect of the disease. Now, the problem I found, and the benefit in understanding all these different theories, is that as a cancer patient going into this, it's good to know all this, because the vast majority of oncologists, they subscribe to the somatic mutation theory only, pretty much. They ignore a lot of these other theories and the treatments associated with them, which is why my friend Sam was not provided with this information, and she wasn't aware of the other therapies that are associated with them. So it's important to realize that this is currently the state of the vast majority of oncologists, particularly in the UK or in the West, I think. There are a number of fantastic oncologists who are going above and beyond that, looking at the metabolic theory and all these other theories like yourself, Erin, and applying all these other therapies, which I think is incredibly important to the survival of cancer patients. So that's one of the major drawbacks with the somatic mutation theory, or the proponents who support that theory. The other is that the somatic mutation theory, when you put it against the hallmarks of cancer, it appears to be the least accurate. Now, this is it was quite shocking for me to realize this. And it's important for cancer patients, again, to realize this, because when you are provided with the treatments associated with mainstream medicine, often the oncologist is doing it from the perspective of the somatic mutation theory. So you're essentially subscribing to a theory that is not as accurate as the other theories that are available. So the treatments you are being supplied with are not necessarily going to be the most effective when you realize that there are other theories that are more accurate. That suggests that those other theories are targeting something more significant within the cell that relates directly to the development of the disease, and therefore you're going to have a better outcome.
That's correct.
Very quickly, I came across a number of shortcomings of the somatic mutation theory. I'll just very quickly run through them. You have the DNA transfer experiments, which is where you take the cancerous DNA from a tumor and you place it into an embryo, a healthy embryo. And the idea behind this experiment is to see that healthy embryo grow out of control, as you would see with a cancer, because the notion is that those transferred DNA genes are the cause and driver of cancerous conditions. What we find in these experiments is that cancer does not arise, or abnormal growth does not arise. So that's a big hole or a big contention within the theory. There's also a number of cancers that don't harbor any driver mutations. So at the very least, those cancers are not associated with DNA mutations, and something else is actually driving the disease. So it's hard to explain cancer being DNA based when cancer develops without those mutations occurring. In many cases, there aren't enough driver mutations to actually account for the disease and all its hallmarks. Mutations are often random and fail to explain the consistency of cancer. Again, that's the hallmarks of cancer. Even the cells within the same tumor, the mutations are random. So this doesn't sit well with the fact that cancer follows a consistent path. Now, this is the beauty of the metabolic theory, in the sense that they're highlighting the consistency. In order to explain the consistency of cancer, you have this consistency with the abnormal metabolism shift we see to glycolysis. So the Warburg effect, this occurs in nearly all solid cancers. So metabolic theory, in a sense, can explain the consistency that the somatic mutation theory can't. And then in presenting the atavistic theory he co-authored, Professor Paul Davies in about 2013 highlighted a number of review studies from the National Institute of Health, where they were looking at about 1 million cancer studies based on the genetic foundation of the somatic mutation theory. And they found that up to 80% of these foundational studies were not able to be replicated, in effect, incorrect. So again, there's another huge contention with the somatic mutation theory, in that it seems to be based upon largely data that cannot be replicated. And then on top of that, you have a failure to explain the vast majority of the hallmarks I will show you in a minute. So it throws that into contention. So going through all this detail over the 8 years, I realized that the metabolic theory, being as though it can explain a higher proportion, at least 7 hallmarks of the disease, suggests that it's identified a key feature of cancer. And as we know, abnormal metabolism is present in nearly all solid tumors. So I realized that this was remarkable, and there were treatments associated with this theory, which is essentially metabolic treatments to starve the cancer of glucose, glutamine, to reinvigorate the mitochondria, in the hope that we can use hyperbaric oxygen therapy and other oxygen therapies such as ozone to stimulate the mitochondria into action, so they gain more autonomy over the cell in order to be able to control the cancer cell itself. And I was largely taken in by the metabolic theory, and I still am. I support the metabolic theory. It's very clear to me that the Warburg effect is a key feature, because a lot of the other hallmarks appear to be downstream events of the Warburg effect. So in a sense, the metabolic theory is explaining the consistency of the disease. And when this energy shift occurs in cancer, to glycolysis, we see the rest of the hallmarks seem to be explained by this process. So the metabolic theory is absolutely key. But as I carried on through my research, I was coming across a number of contentions with the metabolic theory, which I quickly list here and I'll very quickly go through. Many of the studies show that OXPHOS is actually still operational to varying degrees in some of the cancers. For instance, targeting OXPHOS using the drug doxycycline and fatty acids using statins actually kills cancer cells in a number of different studies, which suggests that mitochondria are actually using OXPHOS to a certain degree. Also, there is, and this is a contention that Professor Seyfried himself brings up, he couldn't find any particular mitochondrial DNA mutations that could explain why OXPHOS is defective. And similarly, cardiolipin abnormalities are present in mitochondria within cancer cells. And this forms part of the electron transport chain and OXPHOS, essentially. The argument here is that these cardiolipin abnormalities add to the failure of OXPHOS, and this is why the switch occurs. But even Professor Seyfried admits as well on this that children that are born with Barth syndrome also harbor this same cardiolipin abnormality. However, they rarely develop cancer. So there must be more to the process than just cardiolipin abnormalities. So what I'm basically finding is that this idea that mitochondria, that the Warburg effect occurs because mitochondria are damaged, is a little bit of a hard sell at the moment, because yes, mitochondria are damaged to a certain degree, but the specific damage that can explain why OXPHOS is defective or not operational cannot be directly found at the moment. And OXPHOS appears to be actually operational in certain circumstances, which suggested to me initially that the mitochondria are potentially being suppressed. Now, if you look at studies into cell death mechanism, apoptosis, if you supply, well, let me first say that the metabolic theory suggests that because mitochondria are dysfunctional, then apoptosis does not occur, because apoptosis, the apoptotic pathway, the cell death pathway, is dysfunctional too. However, when you place certain food compounds, such as sulforaphane from broccoli, bromelain from pineapple, onto cancer cells and healthy cells, the healthy cells are fine, the cancer cells reinstigate apoptosis. So they reinstigate the mitochondrial cell death mechanism, as if that mechanism isn't damaged or defective. So that also leads me to believe that this process is reversible. It's therefore suppressed, as opposed to being defective. And there are a number of other issues as well. There are oncocytomas, are benign tumors. They harbor defective mitochondria to the extent that those mitochondria can't produce reactive oxygen species. So effectively aligning themselves with the metabolic theory. However, they don't result in cancer. Generally, they result in benign, very slow growing tumors. So there's a contention there. Also, glycolysis in other cells, and I spelled glycolysis wrong there. Glycolysis in other cells, such as quiescent fibroblasts, stem cells, and endothelial cells, primarily utilize glycolysis as their main energy system. And as an act of normal operation, they don't generate into cancer because of that. And again, the last one would be prostate cancer. Initially utilizes OXPHOS for energy and then transitions at a much later date to glycolysis. So glycolysis doesn't occur first, which is the argument for the metabolic theory. So there's a challenge there from prostate cancer. So all this results in the notion that that the metabolic theory, whilst getting very close to uncovering the details of cancer, then these contentions suggest that it might not actually be dysfunctional mitochondria that cause the disease. That's not to say the metabolic theory is wrong. All I'm saying is there's a significance there, and the Warburg effect is key. So I carried on my research whilst realizing that the fundamental key to potentially identifying the underlying cause of cancer, if it isn't dysfunctional mitochondria, is to identify another cause of the Warburg effect. because the Warburg effect is pivotal. This is what leads, this energy shift is what leads essentially to the rest of the hallmarks of cancer. So whatever is causing this energy shift, if something else can cause it, must be the underlying cause of cancer or another key feature that's driving the disease. So I had this in the back of my mind as I was doing more research. I went off and I started studying all sorts of other things aside from cancer. And I was looking at an infectious paper, and that infectious paper that I stumbled across was discussing how intracellular fungal pathogens invade the cell, and then what happens within epithelial cells as well as immune cells. And they mentioned that cells instigate on purpose a Warburg-like metabolism. And that was the key moment for me, because I suddenly realized that something else could trigger the Warburg effect and explain it. And then I went on to study this in greater detail to find out what would happen if these pathogens are sustained within the cell. The Warburg effect would be sustained. So then I began realizing that with the fact that apoptosis seems like it's suppressed and OXPHOS seems like it's suppressed, that's where I drew this conclusion that just maybe these pathogens aren't causing cancer by damaging the cell. They're causing cancer by suppressing the key mechanisms of the disease, and then that leads to tumor growth. So this, explaining the Warburg effect is key. This is where my cell suppression theory comes in. It provides an alternative explanation for the Warburg effect itself. And then what I found was, as I went through looking at all the other hallmarks of the disease, I found that I could actually explain all of them with the interactions that are going on with intracellular fungal pathogens in particular. And I'm not saying that just fungal pathogens are the underlying cause. I'm saying they are the main mechanism, but bacteria and viruses also play a role, as well as parasites. It's just we need to try and define what level of role they play. So from this, after this 8 years, I found that really what I've created here, and a lot of others have mentioned this, is that I've created a theory that unifies all the other theories, because I can explain all aspects of the other disease and how they all aspects of the other theories and how they all tie together within this paradigm of these fungal pathogens controlling the metabolism of the cell and the cell death mechanism in order to thrive, to gain access to the nutrients within the cell. So if I very quickly move on to the hallmarks. So these are the 10 hallmarks that Douglas Hanahan and Robert Weinberg have identified. There are 4 more to be added to that, but they only came out recently, and it's not entirely clear if they're all accepted yet. So I'll stick with these. But I just created this chart, which is in my book, just to highlight the difference between the model that I've presented and the various different cancer theories that are present. And here we show a number of flaws with the DNA theory or the somatic mutation theory, in the sense that, and this is my analysis, others may contend this, but from my analysis, it seems that the DNA theory is only able to explain 2 of these really important hallmarks. The stem cell theory fares much better, and the metabolic theory has an issue with 3. Now, I'm sure Professor Seafood will contend differently, and that's for us to discuss that separately. However, I'm showing that there's an alternative explanation for the faulty energy system, the hallmark 7, which is the Warburg effect. So here we can see that my theory is able to explain all 10. Now, because again, I'm not a scientist, I thought I needed to go further than this, and I needed more credibility. As I was going through my research, I realized there were a number of other features of cancer that need to be explained, such as using lactate as fuel, fat as fuel, glutamine, arginine as fuel, the reverse Warburg effect, the role of iron. All these other aspects of the disease kept cropping up, and I couldn't find an explanation for them. And a number of the other mainstream theories couldn't explain them either. And I thought, well, if I have hit upon something here, then my theory should be able to explain these as well. And as you can see with this particular table, I've explained them all, and I include that explanation within my book too. And there are a number of other things that I haven't included within this list that I also explain. So I think that itself is quite powerful to highlight, this is not just a theory where I explain 1 or 2 things. I'm providing an explanation for a coherent explanation for almost everything within that list, and a number of others besides. Now, this is interesting. This is a paper discussing the fairly recent discovery of fungal pathogens and bacterial pathogens present within all cancers. So here they're just specifically talking about they found fungi to promote tumorigenesis in different body sites, including lung, breast, skin, brain, bone, ovary, colon, head, and neck and stomach cancer, which are just listed here. So this paper is highlighting that just maybe the relationship we're finding with fungi now, we should be thinking of the involvement of them as a new hallmark of cancer, which is really quite revealing for someone to be suggesting that. And just very quickly to touch on the other theories again, and to touch on my process to show how different my paradigm is that when you look at pretty much all mainstream theories, they fall under the same umbrella. And that is carcinogens and infection. They cause inflammation and cell damage, which results in malfunction of the cell. And it's the malfunction of the cell that then generates cancer. So this is all the theories that I previously mentioned here. And then all these theories are trying to explain cancer through the hallmarks, but the damage that is acquired. And they're trying to identify which particular damage is causing the disease to explain these hallmarks. However, with such as the random DNA damage within the nucleus, and the fact that we can't find specific damage within mitochondria, the trouble is that we can't find the specific damage that could explain each of these hallmarks. So there's a problem here with these theories. We can't explain the consistency of the disease because we can't identify the specific mechanism, the specific damage that is causing these the mechanisms within these theories. So I'm coming from the perspective of carcinogens actually cause the inflammation and cell damage, but that then facilitates the infectious process. So what we have instead is the pathogens enter the cell and are able to suppress the cell mechanisms. And from this perspective, as I've already shown, you can explain all key hallmarks of the disease through this suppression mechanism. And this explains carcinogenesis in full, and the consistency of the disease itself. And from this, we can look at specific solutions.
Right. So just for a brief moment to kind of,
Yeah.
I always like to reiterate to patients and people listening is you talk about, what really initiates this and the carcinogens. Okay. So, kind of go over the carcinogens as much as you can.
Okay.
And also, I think it's important to talk about the use of antibiotics that happen naturally in the course of someone's life, but also in the cancer process. If they do surgery, they automatically get antibiotics. And then again, you create a larger population of yeast.
Yeah, okay, no problem. So this set of images kind of explains exactly how fungal pathogen gains control of the cell and why it's the fungal pathogen that I'm proposing is the underlying cause. So here we have a carcinogen, and cell damage occurs. Often hypoxia and glycolysis is instigated in order to generate inflammation and enable the repair process of the cell. This is the normal repair process. And then once everything goes back to normal, that's fine. But what we find with cancer, a lot of the time, the inflammation is chronic, ongoing. So the carcinogens are ongoing. They're causing all sorts of damage to the cell, weakening the immune system at the same time. So what we have when in cancer initiation is chronic inflammation, lactic acid production, overproduction of lactic acid because of the overuse of glycolysis, iron overload. So this is where iron can no longer be detained within the cell. We have an increase in glucose feeding into the cell, in immune suppression. This particularly happens at the site of damage, which is important. So here we have the overuse of antibiotics from a medical standpoint, from a food standpoint. The meat that we consume is now heavily laden with antibiotics, and a lot of the foods that we consume as well are feeding particular pathogens. And what I'm finding is with this antibiotic overuse, you're causing microbiome dysbiosis, which favors particular fungal pathogens. And this is where they enter into this chronic inflammatory process. So we're now finding that a lot of tissue throughout the body have their own microbiome. And fungal pathogens as well as bacteria exist within biofilms within these settings throughout the body. And this biofilm protects these pathogens. So when the terrain is damaged, as it is with chronic inflammation and the use of antibiotics, this presents an opportunity for a dominant fungal pathogen niche to sense that the immune system's weak and invade cells. Now, this is aided by the fact that lactic acid feeds the fungal pathogens. Iron feeds fungal virulence and glucose as well. What you also have is this overabundance of lactic acid and iron overload within the damaged tissue that the fungal pathogen is now attempting to invade. That lactic acid and iron actually suppresses immune cells. So you now have a situation where the chronic inflammation and the carcinogens, the toxins, the pesticides, they have caused such damage to the tissue and the terrain that it's favoring the fungal pathogen and suppressing the immune system at that site of damage, which then allows the fungal pathogen to invade intracellularly into the cell. At the same time, you've got mitochondria being damaged, so they're unable to generate the same level of resistance to the fungal pathogen entering the cell. So this whole process with these carcinogens and chronic inflammation actually favors fungal infection. So then what we have is there are many different routes that the pathogen invades the cell, and endocytosis occurs through EGFR and HER2, which are growth receptors. Mm-hmm. So that partly explains why the growth of cancer cells are increased. E-cadherin is often degraded by the pathogen itself, as well as a number of DNA mutations that are highly associated with an increased risk of cancer. They also degrade E-cadherin. There's a commonality there. Now, E-cadherin is a junction within cells that allows them to stick together, essentially, and it also acts as a barrier against infection. So when E-cadherin is reduced, you have cells that are able to fall away from each other, which is a major aspect in metastasis, the ability of cells to diverge into the immune system, into the bloodstream. I don't know why I had a went blank there, but into the bloodstream. So that's major, and it also enables fungal pathogens to invade the cell. So we also see there's an upregulation of PD-L1 expression and nagalase expression within tumors. Now, nagalase is produced by fungal pathogens as well as bacterial pathogens in order to reduce the immune response. And PD-L1 essentially tells immune cells that the cell that's expressing this PDL expression, that it's a friend. So essentially what the fungal pathogen is doing is it's overexpressing these proteins that hide the cell from the immune system. So you've got even further immune evasion going on here. These pathogens are expert at actually invading cells and hiding from the immune system and modulating it. So at the same time, what we also have is the Warburg effect is occurring. It's occurring because of chronic inflammation anyway, so glycolysis is occurring, but when the pathogen invades the cell, the Warburg effect is instigated because what mitochondria do is they actually switch off OXPHOS. So they switch off the ability of themselves to create energy via oxygen because they want to use the oxygen instead to create reactive oxygen species in order to kill the invading pathogen. So that's the explanation for why the energy shift occurs. So just the very fact of the pathogen invading the cell causes the Warburg effect, an upregulation of the mTOR pathway and other pathways associated with glycolysis. These intracellular pathogens also block the cell death mechanism. Many pathways of doing this, upregulation of BCL2, that blocks cell death. So now you have the process, if we just pause it there, where the pathogen has invaded the cell, the immune response is dampened. It's successful in that process because it's been able to suppress the mitochondrial defense mechanisms. You've also got cell death mechanisms suppressed, and glycolysis itself is a proliferative state. So now you've got the development of a tumor. Simply because the pathogen is invaded, glycolysis is rife, and cell death mechanisms are blocked or suppressed. Excessive production of lactic acid because of the Warburg effect results in angiogenesis, as well as upregulation of MMP9, which is instigated by the pathogen as well, in order to generate further inflammation. I mean, there's a lot more detail involved in this. I'm just really simplifying it. And then as time goes on, we have an incredible amount of mycotoxins, free radicals being produced, methyl deficiency, loss of E-cadherin, damage to DNA, which essentially explains the random DNA damage that proponents of the somatic mutation theory think causes the disease. So really, you could argue that this random DNA damage is a symptom of this fungal invasion process. At the same time, so much damage is going on that mitochondria become damaged as well. And through that process, mitochondria, after a certain level of damage, enter into a process called retrograde signaling, where they end up transitioning the cell through contact with the nucleus into establishing an epithelial to mesenchymal transition into what is essentially a cell now that has stem cell properties, so unlimited growth potential. When the cell essentially breaks away from its initial site, travels into the bloodstream, what we see is galectin-3 is highly expressed on the surface of the cell. Now, this is a highly sticky protein and has been blamed for allowing the cell to migrate to somewhere else and stick to somewhere else within the body. But what we also find, which aligns with my theory, is galectin-3 is also an antifungal response. So this is essentially being presented to the cell in order to kill the fungal pathogen present within. So it highlights again this link to fungal pathogens. And then, of course, if the fungal pathogen isn't killed, we essentially have metastasis occurring, where these cells that have spread throughout the bloodstream now exist somewhere else within the body and also start growing. Now, the reason why they continue to grow is a number of reasons. It could be because the fungal pathogen also travels with that particular part of the tumor that's broken off, or it's because the primary tumor is signaling through exosomes and various other mechanisms to that tissue at a distance to continue and sustain the Warburg effect, because it still thinks it's part of the same tumor. They're part of the same tissue, and they're in this process of trying to eliminate the pathogen, essentially. So that would be almost pretty much the entire process of carcinogenesis explained through the invasion of fungal pathogens. And incidentally, I'd just like to chuck one thing in there. The abscopal effect. I can offer an explanation for that. That's where the primary tumor is treated and secondary tumors also are killed, even though they are not specifically targeted with the treatment. Now, how I explain this is that cancer essentially acts as a hive mind, in the sense that the fungal pathogen is in the primary tumor. So cells around the infected cell also are advised, but signaled by those cells to switch to the Warburg effect. So you won't necessarily have a fungal pathogen in every single cell within the tumor. What you've got is these cells working commensally in order to eliminate the pathogen, because the Warburg effect is an anti-infection response. One of the ideas of this is to eliminate the glucose within the surrounding environment so that the pathogen can't feed on that glucose, because the glucose is the fungal pathogen's primary food source. So you have, for every one infected cell, you have an abundance of other cells in the periphery also switching to the Warburg effect, even though they're not infected, in order to eliminate the pathogen. Now, if the pathogen isn't eliminated, then all these other cells, including the distant cells in the migrated tumor, are also still expressing the Warburg effect, because the pathogen is still present. There's this feedback loop of communication, which is saying we still haven't eliminated the pathogen yet. So in terms of the abscopal effect, when you treat the primary tumor and you eliminate the fungal pathogen present in that primary tumor, the signals then to the rest of the secondary tumors are now eliminated to continue with the Warburg effect, and those cells can continue on with the cycle of repair, which is the Dr. Robert Navio's cell danger response model. That model is finished, and then those cells commit apoptosis because they realize they're in the wrong area of the body, and of course they're going to cause a problem for the host, and of course they shrink because of that reason. That was just something else I was going to throw in there that I wasn't planning on explaining. So yeah, that's the process in terms of antibiotics and how carcinogens can generate the disease, because it's always been a contention of mine. How can so many different carcinogens that cause so much different damage to the cell cause the same consistency of the disease? And here I'm saying, well, the consistency is the fungal pathogen that takes advantage of the myriad of carcinogens and the different damage it causes, because it generates essentially a weakened immune system, chronic inflammation, an overproduction of lactic acid, and iron overload. And those four conditions effectively facilitate fungal infection and suppress the immune system, handing the advantage to the fungal pathogen.
Okay, so I think it's really important to, after that splendid explanation, how conventional therapies continue the propagation of fungal growth and really make those cancer stem cells ravage and have a predisposition to metastasis.
Yeah, well, a number of chemotherapies are obviously very toxic. They do affect negatively the microbiome in favor of fungal pathogens. In terms of cancer stem cells, what we find is that, and Dr. Robert Weinberg highlights this, that stem cells are very efficient at eliminating toxins. So chemotherapy itself doesn't always eliminate them. Now, this is a big problem. So what you can often get is that because the mass of the tumor is made up of differentiated cells, so about 98% of the mass of the tumor are differentiated cells, 2% being the stem cells. Chemotherapy will be able to eliminate a large number of these differentiated cells, so the tumor shrinks quite dramatically, and it's seen as a victory. However, how I explain this is that those free radicals that are produced by the differentiated cells from the chemotherapy generate a high level of free radicals, and those free radicals kill the fungal pathogens within the vicinity of those cells, hence the reduction of the tumor. However, fungal pathogens that exist within the stem cells and the stem cells themselves eliminate or do not absorb the chemotherapy, which means they are protecting the fungal pathogen. And unless you kill those stem cells, what's going to happen is that those stem cells are suddenly presented with information that the tumor itself, the thing, they kind of see the tumor as their own tissue or our tissue, because they're associated with the tumor itself. So if you lose a lot of cells, those cancer stem cells suddenly realize that they've got to replenish that tissue or the host is going to die, or so they think. So what they do is they duplicate themselves because they need to replace so many cells that have been lost, and then they upregulate how quickly they're producing new differentiated cells. So what essentially chemotherapy and Robert Weinberg is saying is that chemotherapy can stimulate cancer stem cells to grow more aggressive. And what you have is the tumor regrows, but this time there's more stem cells, and the chemotherapy can't produce the same amount of free radicals it previously produced because it's already damaged more of the mitochondria that produce these free radicals. So what you have is, over time, a reduced amount of free radicals being produced, increased cancer stem cells, and increased rate of growth that outperforms the ability of the chemotherapy to actually do the damage it needs to do to kill the tumor. And that's when you get chemotherapy resistance. But quite often it's said that the resistance occurs because the cancer cell has intelligently developed resistance through mutations. But I argue it's not because of that. It's because of the reduced amount of free radicals. There's less damage now occurring through the chemotherapy, and it's actually instigating cancer stem cells to act more aggressively, thus growing the tumor.
Okay. So of course, you gave an elaborate discussion of the hallmarks and how the mechanisms of all this work. So, people always want to go, okay, now what do I do? And I will, of course, go over later with all of our listeners and go over kind of the things that we do, because we always address fungus in the patient, because that is, like you said, there's been lots in the literature. And so what have you, I know you probably have this in your book, but for all the people listening worldwide, let's give them your bird's eye view of effective antifungal strategies. I know we had not Bruce Lipton, but we had Seafruit. I've known him a long time. So, of course, he highly encourages the ketogenic, starving the cancer, and which is not a diet for every person, okay? But it is a great tool, especially if you're pre-diabetic and diabetic. So why don't you talk about that?
Okay, I'll try and really simplify this. Essentially, along the same lines of taking on board the metabolic theory and the tissue organization field theory, the approach is to initially address the terrain. So you're reducing inflammation and looking at the health of the body. Then you also want to address the microbiome. So you want to make that healthy. Both of these things will make it difficult for fungal pathogens to invade cells. And then you want to be looking at targeting the metabolism of the cancer cells, as in following the protocol of the metabolic theory, because the same fuels that are used by the cancer cell, glucose and glutamine, are the same main primary fuels of the fungal pathogen themselves. So not only are you restricting that to the cancer cell, you're restricting it to the pathogen. So fasting, exercising, ketogenic diet, but also using off-label drugs. So a number of these off-label drugs can target the metabolism in different ways of cells, including fat, so statins as well. But what I found is, and the reason why I'm suggesting these, is that a lot of the off-label drugs that are being utilized, such as metformin, they're also antifungal in their own right. So we see this correlation again with this antifungal approach. So in effect, what's happening already, I feel that a lot of the benefit patients are receiving is because clinicians are inadvertently targeting elements of the fungal pathogens at the same time as restricting the metabolism. And then, that is what I'm assuming a lot of functional medicine practitioners and yourself, you're already doing. That's what you're already doing. But what I'm adding to the mix is adding in specifically to target fungal pathogens. So testing initially for the pathogens within the body, the fungal pathogens that are present, so you know which antifungal drugs to use, and increasing that with off-label drugs as well, because certain drugs such as statins as well can work in synergy, and certain antibiotics can work in synergy with particular antifungals, because the other problem is antifungals are highly toxic.
Right.
So fungal pathogens and human cells share similar pathways. So it's not just the answer is not just antifungal drugs, because not all antifungal drugs target all fungal pathogens. It's a combination, but really trying to do all those things I've just mentioned, but also add on top of that specifically targeting fungal pathogens as well as part of the protocol.
Right, exactly. And we do that. But like you said, those antifungal medications are very hard on the liver. I find them, though, very effective, but I always do liver protection when I give an antifungal, always, or any medication. The liver needs to be protected, because on today's world, there's so much attacking the body. That's why fatty liver is so high. Incidence of it is so high. So if your patient has fatty liver, that drug can be very toxic to a patient like that. So we try to get rid of the fatty liver. We also, and then so that we can administer these medications. So it's always not such an easy little process, as you said.
Absolutely not.
Yeah. And so, we're so used to, like, okay, you just take this medicine and then you're fine. And there's no such thing like that when it comes to cancer.
And even anti-parasitic drugs. Professor
Right.
Seafood is already proposing in a pulse solution is mebendazole and fenbendazole. But we also find out with the antiparasitic drugs, which can target metabolism, they're also antifungal as well with common fungal pathogens. So again, adding those particular drugs, they can work in synergy with the antifungals.
It's
Right.
very
So,
interesting. Mark's done quite a review in his book of the treatments which are in conventional medicine and outside,
right.
which are being quite successful, that happen to be antifungals as well. And that's a very interesting thing to look at, because of course that's not the reason they're being prescribed, but they happen to be ones that work quite well.
Yeah,
Right.
tamoxifen, for instance, is also antifungal. Used
Oh,
in breast cancer.
wonderful. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, and I always talk about with patients, there's over 310 drugs in the literature that have the potential to start cancer. And then we have to address really the targeted drugs that can be beneficial in the antifungal theory and so forth. So this has been incredible. Everyone, you can see Mark's book, The Cancer Resolution. I highly encourage patients to get fully educated, because this was just a very very small version of what this book is all about. And the more that we educate ourselves, the more we understand and can change our condition. So I highly encourage people to get that book and take a deep dive into it. And then, Robin, what parting words do you have for our listeners?
Well, I wanted to underline the point that it's a thick book. It looks a little bit imposing, Mark's, but he has written it for the public. It's not a science manual, This is a book for the public, and anybody who has the interest, and there's plenty of people with sufficient reason to have the interest, can actually find out what he's talking about and understand it for themselves, and therefore develop their own direction as to how they might want to address their situation. So it's great that he's done it that way, because that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to be able to help the people he knows, his friends, and so it's a generous piece of work, which is, it's accessible by everybody.
Yes, this is wonderful. And thank you guys for being part of my life journey and mission. And we share a lot of common values in really prevention and treatment of cancer. So I truly appreciate the partnership.
Thank you for having us on board. It's been a pleasure speaking to you.
Yes, great to speak with you guys too.
Yeah,
So
wonderful.
we'll be in touch, and because this is going to be, it's going to be great if we can, really continue to tell people about this, because this is what it's all about. And and people need to know, because every single day all over the world, patients are getting treatment and they're getting inadequate treatment.
Absolutely. I think that's the main point, isn't it? I'm not necessarily saying I'm right. I'm saying it points down this direction, and it's an abundance of evidence. It needs to be looked at, but also that we need to rethink the paradigm. And even if I'm just shifting the view away from the current paradigm to looking at the metabolic side of things, the terrain and everything else, that's just a win-win. Just looking at that, because we're focusing far too much on the somatic mutation theory, unfortunately.
Right, exactly. All right. Well, thank you guys for taking the time, and let's continue to stay in touch.
Yes, please do. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for getting in touch.
All right. Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.